Thank you, Mark. Come and sit down. In fact, while you're sitting down, I'll ask you a quick question as you're sitting down. What's the number one thing that has to change then? You're talking about the frustration, you can't get anything done. What's the biggest barrier to getting something done?
I think the problem is where's the money? I think it's difficult to see, and I asked the question once, and you've got to keep being industry interested, you've got to keep the SMEs interested. And it's quite difficult to see where the money is to actually do the investment, because the money is in things like housing and improved health. And that's quite difficult for an industrialist and a technologist company, and it's quite difficult to materialise. So at this stage, the risk is we talk a lot about it, and I'm not saying we don't need to have that and have those sessions, but we need to put some money out there about bringing some real money into the event. Now, there is bits and pieces, but it's actually very difficult to make it happen. And the length of time that you can do pursuing a very small amount of pilot, for instance. So we're doing a good bit of work with the High-Res England team and with the Manchester team to do a very small pilot. The amount of effort is years of, literally 2 years to do this much. And we just need to try and find ways of accelerating. And that needs the public sector and the industries and the SMEs to work together in a different way than they do today. We need to break some of the silos down.
There's lots of people along here who try to make things happen and have made things happen. Do you all have that sense of frustration that there's lots of red tape, that it's hard getting governments and private money together, all that kind of thing? Are you as pessimistic?
I think for me, one of the issues is, you spoke about R&D and having the backing to do useful R&D, and it's having, because it's hard to do something, isn't it? There's an inertia that comes with knowing this is a really big problem, and if we go down the wrong path, it will be terrible, and we've built this infrastructure. But actually the idea of the live lab, the opportunity to use campuses and various places to actually try out things as a whole, not just bits of them, I think is a really big story, isn't it? And so having funding for those opportunities, I think, would make a really big difference.
Isabel, what were your experiences in London of trying to get things done?
I don't agree in one sense, which is you have to see organizational decision-making and politics as more of a science than an art, right? So it's a puzzle that can be solved, and you can puppet master anything to happen, and Glenn knows this from being in these institutions. But you have to approach it as a chess game that you have to win, you know? And I think as an industry, the built environment industry is quite passive. Obviously not everybody here, we're amazing and proactive, but you know, it's kind of like we need to start from the proposition that we can come up, so if Deliveroo, Amazon, Uber, or whoever, we're sitting here trying to solve the problem you just articulated, and of course I agree with you, they wouldn't be like, how can we manipulate this terrible thing to happen, right? That's what you're saying. You're basically saying at the outset, we need to start from a position of like, we're gonna make everyone's life a lot better, they're gonna be super happy, and they'll be willing to pay for it as well. They'll pay extra for it, because their lives are gonna be better. So now, if we work backwards from that, that's a political proposition as well. And that is doable now with mobile phone technology, all the things that are happening. So I think we have to kind of reboot ourselves as an industry and really rethink. I mean, it sort of goes a bit to what you were describing earlier. It's like putting, I don't know, something that people would love at the heart of what it is that we're trying to do here. Then the politics and the organizational opposition will just dissipate completely. Yeah, and we need to take that on as an industry, not wait for someone else to sort it. And I know you're not saying that, Mark, but I think it's an important kind of emotional change that we need to have in how we think about this.
I mean, Glyn, if you look at that London experience, you know, Uber arrived very quickly in lots of cities, and there was a lot of resistance to it, wasn't there?
Mm-hmm. And I think I think actually Uber proved that we have a regulatory position in London that's the right thing to do, and that we shouldn't shy away from that in the face of technology. But I think we've also learned from that in the way that we approach new technology. And what we're doing is we're putting in place a type of 3-step model so that we engage early with people who have ideas, we assess what they're doing, and then we help them deliver it. And that means looking at different routes to procurement, it means looking at different routes to market engagement to make sure that we're actually working with people and not necessarily against them straight away. So I think it was a great example for us. I think we've learned from it, they've definitely learned from it. And I think actually, as you see new things coming into London now, electric scooters are a great example in the Olympic Park this week. We're actually working with those individuals as opposed to taking the purely regulatory approach that we have done in the past.
Okay, what was that electric scooter thing? 'Cause I didn't see that.
So there's a company that's launching electric scooters in Olympic Park this week.
Okay. And you've worked with them rather than resist kind of thing. Dave, you wanted to pitch in.
Yeah, so I agree that there is a role for regulation, and I think that's absolutely the right role for cities and authorities to play. I think where you've got the private sector and crowdfunding and things like that, it makes it very easy for a company with an idea to bring a product to market and disrupt even the best laid regulations. They're also profit driven, which means they don't necessarily consider social inclusion and equality as one of the main aims that they have. And whilst we ought to embrace the disruption that that brings and moving things forward in a way, we also need to make sure that the services we provide still appeal to everybody, are still accessible for everybody. And that's definitely the role that a regulatory authority in the city can help with.
Margot, I'm going to give you a question from the audience, okay? Someone's using the Slido. How do we achieve reliable, high-quality public transport in our cities, given the continued focus on road infrastructure? Obviously, buses use roads, but you get the point.
Sure. Well, that's a really interesting question, and that's something that we've dealt with in London, but also in other cities globally. And I think the thing that really does it for me is actually taking the metric away from cost and putting it on time. I was involved in getting the metro up and running in Dubai, and that's a really great example because, in Dubai there's a very strong car culture. People associate, kind of a sense of status with their car, which is not only in Dubai, that's all over the world. But the thing that really got people to start using the metro system in Dubai was the fact that they could take their limousine to the airport and it would take 2.5 hours, or they could take the metro and it would take 30 minutes. And all of a sudden, that really shifted the variety of people that were using the metro, and it started to get a lot more diverse, and we actually got people out of their cars using it.
That's an interesting example. So initially, people weren't using it, and people cottoned onto it, but I guess you had to build it first to convince people of the benefits, didn't you?
In that case.
It's the carrot versus stick issue. So ultimately, you're creating the information people require and the experience people require to change their behaviours, which is becoming, I think, we're in danger of making it just being punitive to use your car to force people onto the roads, which is dangerously exclusive rather than inclusive in some cases. My perception is certainly in the outer parts of London it becomes more exclusive, and there's a bit of a focus on central London and a forgetting of outer London. I think if you're a Londoner, you'll see it. So I think you need to connect the journeys across the modes, and you need to get people to understand the benefits and the value to them, as well as the impact on the society and the pollution and everything else. And that's a positive. We need to use the tools to create carrots, not sticks in my particular, but you really want to change it permanently.
Claire, do you think that different cities need different things? So we were looking to move to Manchester because my job was moving to Manchester at the time. We were looking at houses. We were looking at houses on train lines because we were in that London mindset of that's how you get into work. And everyone kind of laughed when we were kind of doing it and said, no, you'll drive. And I've driven into central Manchester. I know, some of the motorways up there are pretty horrible, but I've driven in there at 5, 6 at night, got to the Midland Park. You can't do that in London. So there isn't really an incentive to get the tram out to Salford, which is what we were being advised to do. It's not a very good service, and the car was a lot easier. So different people need different things, don't
Yeah, I think that's right. Undoubtedly, cities are different. But actually, the people that use them all want the same thing, really. They want reliable journeys. I think now, what you've described there is it happens that in one city, the car is the more reliable, and in another, it's another form, and it comes back to why would people use that. So they want reliable journeys, they want safe journeys. We can list 4 or 5 attributes that people want from mobility, and so they may be delivered in different ways depending on the infrastructure that's already there or the topography of the city and all of that. But overlaid on that are the maybe higher order aims of air quality, the carbon footprint that we're leaving, and all of those kind of higher order aims, which are one removed for sure from the immediate, it costs me this much in time or money. People feel that. It's a little bit more nebulous, this idea of, you know, my grandchildren's grandchildren will be under 20 feet of water. Now, of course that matters, but so I think we can know what people want, but how that's delivered in different places will differ, I guess, yeah.
Isabel, does the environment come into people's thinking in your experience, or do you have to foist environmentally friendly ways of travel onto people because they're not as convenient?
So as a kind of strong environmentalist, I would say that we completely overestimate how much people care about it. People feel guilty about it. They feel they should care, all these things. They don't actually care. But there are elements within the environment agenda in different cities where the politics are different that are hot topics. So, you know, when I started working at TfL ages ago, carbon was the big thing. That was what Ken was talking about. Then it became air pollution, thanks in part to a very effective lobby, and that's great. So you hook all the things you want to do onto whatever the hot subject is at that time. Who cares what it is? So air pollution works a lot better as an emotive issue to get people to go, yeah, I want that. And you could argue that road pricing in London is going forward under the guise of the low emission zones further development, and that's just the way that's worked. But unless it's basically making people's lives significantly better in the most basic terms, a lot cheaper, a lot faster, a lot more reliable, you can forget it. But that's why we need to hook these worthy things onto what people really care about, which is, my journey's going to be twice as reliable. Good, I want to travel in that.
Glenn, there's been lots of talk of data amongst all of you. You all mentioned data. What role does data play in the kind of decisions you guys are taking? And we'll move on as well to sharing the data, because that's clearly a massive issue. It's been gobbled up all over the place, but how do you get access to it? How do you put it out to the public domain and use it for these?
So data's really important. Knowing where people are, where they're going to, being able to give them the right information to allow them to make informed choices. Data's absolutely at the type of heart of everything that we do. I look after the Traffic Control Centre in London. We've really focused our decision making in there on data that we're getting in through a variety of sources, fusing that data to give us the richest picture to allow us to make the right decisions in terms of how we manage the different modes moving around the network. Now, in terms of sharing that data, actually, I think we've taken some really interesting and useful steps in London. We've made all our data free. Any data that we can do, it's out there. There are APIs that people can use to enable them to harness that data. And, you know, we've seen things like Citymapper, for instance, really build a fantastic reputation off the back of our data and enable people to make the right choices on London's network.
What sort of things can it tell you? In, you know, some practical examples.
So, practical examples. What's a good example? So this morning, unfortunately, we had a collision on Upper Thames Street. We saw that there was significant congestion as a result of that. We were able to put information out around where that location was, alternate routes, and journey times that was then used by the different satellite navigation companies, used by freight companies to allow them to reroute around that location. So having the data and being able to use it, and for other people to consume it and to put it into as many places as possible for people to consume, it's really important.
Okay. Mark, question from the public, so we'll throw this to you. How can the UK make better use of existing solutions and best practice elsewhere in the world? It says here authorities generally have no idea of solutions from elsewhere. Do you think we are a bit isolated and siloed, as they say?
No, ironically, I think actually we're probably one of the best at listening to what other people do and having thought leadership and exploring other cities. I'm not quite sure we then take it to action. I think we seem to hit the wall when we take things to action. I think actually generally we're quite open-minded. Do we explore? Do we have a not invented here mentality? I don't think we particularly do, actually. I don't think we do. I think we're quite good at it. I think the problem is we have a lot of layers of stuff in the way of implementation being blunt. And I think other cities maybe have, other countries and cultures have maybe a little bit more of an impose and you know, we laugh about, we joke about the history of people building new railways in the UK, and there's many, many real issues in the way, such as how the density. But in practice, then we say, oh, the French just go and build it and buy the land. I think there's a cultural issue rather than necessarily a lack of willingness to see what other people do. I think we're quite...
Dave, how do you think we stack up globally in terms of taking ideas and learning from other people?
So I think we're probably very good at thought leadership, and the things that we do well in this country have been about innovating and thinking differently about the problems of the world. I do agree that in today's environment it's much harder to bring those things to implementation, and I think that's partially around the way that the industry has changed, not moving as fast as the way procurement cycles and things like that. The government process, if you like, hasn't caught up with the speed that ideas are generated and brought to market. And for me, if we could increase the speed that some of those things would happen, and we're doing that through the living labs, we're doing that through some of the test houses. That's absolutely the right approach to overcome that barrier.
Margot, you do a lot of things around the world. What's your view?
Yeah. Look, I think in some cases, it can be a case of not only is the grass greener on the other side, but we can be guilty of looking at things going well in other countries and thinking, well, yeah, sure, it works over there, but that's because they're different, and that's because the circumstances are different, and it wouldn't work here. And I think one of the parts of my job is actually to try and bring international solutions to the forefront. So we're bringing the best in the world, and we can sample from that and innovate and prove that it can work here. So that's actually a very enjoyable part of my job. But it is difficult because it's not always just about finding the best solution. It's also about bringing people along for the journey and telling a good story and getting people to truly buy into it and believe it can happen.
Other universal experiences around the world? Does everyone broadly want the same thing in a city and in the countryside around the world?
Absolutely. In fact, the more I travel, the more I find we are all exactly the same. We all want, roofs over our head. We want our children's children to be happy and healthy. We want a safe environment. We all want the same things, 100%.
Claire, I kind of made a joke about things being designed by humans, but we don't know what we want. How do we know what we're going to need in 10 or 15 years' time? Because we can all future gaze, can't we? But everyone's got to get together and actually make it happen.
Yeah, a couple of things in there. I mean, I think we've all now rehearsed the idea that we'll want the same thing in 10 years that we want now. That's the first thing: reliable, safe, cost-effective mobility. The whole idea of being able to map the future, though, I think it's, I think, Margot, you might have talked about forecasting, that even though we don't know the future, maybe from one of you, we have to do that. And I think there's a difference between predicting an exact future and forecasting possibilities, or put them the other way around. And one of the things that we use a fair amount is scenario planning as a technique that doesn't say this is absolutely the future, but here are 4 possible futures, and we might choose to take really extreme ones. So we're not saying this is exactly what's going to happen. We look at future possibilities and say, well, we're going to go really extreme to the right-hand side as we think about this one, and on the same axis we're going to think of exactly the opposite end. We're not saying that either of those are true, but we deal with the what-ifs. And so when you start to build a couple of axes for that, and you can scenario plan in that way, it helps us to manage the uncertainty in sensible ways, I think. So there are techniques that we can use that help us with that. Not saying this is absolutely the trajectory, but it maps our uncertainty a little bit and makes us know that we've thought about possibilities.
Does anyone have a question from the floor? We can get a microphone too. Put your hand up if you're there. Otherwise I can go to the... This chap here. In fact, while we get a microphone to you, I'll go from Isabel. I'll just ask you a quick one from the screen here. Considering the rural carbon footprint per person is 2 to 3 times more than the urban, mainly due to cars, how can we provide better solutions to rural mobility? We have talked a lot about cities, and it is a session about cities, but people go into the city from the countryside. They're not different people, are they? How can we take more account of what the rural people need?
Well, I think that sort of goes back to the point you were making about your diesel car earlier, right? So we don't need everybody to be in the perfect form of transport. We don't need everyone in a train or a bus. We don't need everyone in a zero-emission vehicle. So it's sort of what's the right blend that's going to deliver the very radical reductions in carbon and air pollution that we all want and need. I don't think we should be expecting to get that from rural mobility necessarily, but it's linked to the equity point, which is, how can we use car sharing as a way to tackle, for example, locations in cities with severe deprivation and bad access to transport. So it's going to be really expensive to build a transport connection, a rapid transport connection to that part of New York City, let's say. Can we use car sharing as a way to improve accessibility in that area? But it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be better than what we've got at the moment. And I think rural services are in a similar camp. We're doing some work in New York at the moment about how car sharing, electric vehicles, and all the sort of suite of new technologies could be used to tackle the sort of accessibility black spots in the city. And that's it's actually quite a similar issue to a lot of the rural issues.
Is the assumption still that it's the cities that will grow? Right? When we've got autonomous cars, living in the countryside would be a lot easier if you're older, for example.
I don't know if it's true or not. Our position in London was always that growth will happen. It's not like we can decide to have growth or not have growth. It's occurring. We can have good growth or bad growth. And so that's what we're here to manage. And in your scenario world, it's like it might be high rate, low rate, but that's the trajectory, whether we like it or not.
Hello. Mark Sullivan, former Users Committee member of the 80s and 90s. Claire Williams says she has a book called Human Factors and Ergonomics in Practice. 50 years ago, ergonomics was introduced to us as being really about the science of the human body, seating, moving, and British Rail did a lot to develop seats in trains, particularly in the 1960s. And this was very successful. But we've gone backwards, and I'd like to know, both from her and from Isabel Dedring, why. Because we now have trains which are actually uncomfortable. It's a paradox that stations were pretty ropey in the 60s and 70s, and now, for many reasons, as you can see in the All the Stations series on YouTube, are generally very attractive, but trains have got a lot worse. Alan Williams, of the famous columnist who said that was on the BR Design panel, said the seats going into the Crossrail or the Thameslink service would not have passed the design panel. And even on the overground, I think the seats are all right, but really not to put in a few seats facing each other and all back to the windows, at least on the outer two coaches, was a bad mistake that needs to be corrected. As well, having no toilets on Crossrail. So I just point out that ergonomics is an interesting issue, but for the public, it's the quality of seats in particularly trains, also, of course, airlines. Motor cars, the industry has produced more and more comfortable seats, but I think in railways it's gone backwards, and I just wonder why Claire Williams feels that ergonomics is advancing when it seems to be going backwards in the concept of the seat. The way people travel in public transport. You get on a lovely station, you get in a train, it's uncomfortable.
Well, in defence of all seating designers, who I feel I should defend, very interesting question. I don't know why seating would be less comfortable than it was in those days, except that potentially other factors are at play. Whereas before, the focus was how do we make these seats comfortable? Now the focus is how do we get 50% more seats on this train and make it comfortable. And perhaps it's just the order of things that has changed, and therefore the goals of the system are slightly different. I'm sure people haven't gone out of their way to make them uncomfortable, But you know, much of that is contextual also, isn't it? That actually the legroom that you have is nothing to do with the seat itself, but it enormously impacts how comfortable you are. And so I can't answer your question about who's been doing terrible things to the seats of trains, but my guess is actually there's more at play than simply just focusing on the comfort of that one bit of the system, that there are competing goals.
I think there's something really interesting in what you said, which is that stations have now moved from being transport terminals to being, you know, seen as retail destinations, places in the city, right? So famously, more than half of the people that come to and through King's Cross and St. Pancras are not there to take the train, right? Everybody talks about this. But the trains are still like, well, you're obviously just here to sit on the train. So I think that's changing now, but partly because of wireless technology, people being on their mobiles. People have a different perception of time, and that's evidenced, that people are more happy to sit on the train for longer. So that might actually turn things back in another direction. And with the competition from car sharing, and public transport around the world is losing ridership, how does public transport compete with the rise of new business models in the private sector, car sharing, driverless cars, Uber, Lyft, whatever it is, to attract ridership back, you know, make the experience more pleasurable?
Okay, Mark, one word answer to finish it off. Are you going to be sitting here in 15 years' time and nothing's changed?
I really, truly hope not. I'd like to have retired.
You won't be sitting here. You'll be sitting at home. Thank you so much. Fantastic discussion and brilliant panel. Really